when we think about the history of Christian missions, I think we kind of have, a certain picture in our minds.
Yeah.
But I wonder, what if that picture is, like, incomplete? What if there's a huge part of the story that we're missing?
That's a great question.
Yeah. And what if that story is about the incredible role that African Americans have played in spreading the gospel all around the world?
I think you're right. That is a part of the story that often gets overlooked, and it really deserves a much closer look.
Totally. And that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Yes.
We're going deep, deep, deep into the history of African Americans in global missions.
That's right. And to help us do that, we've got this really fascinating historical survey that we're going to be digging into.
It is fascinating, and it lays out the whole story, like, so clearly.
It does. It really illuminates this long and significant history.
It does. It really does.
And it's something that, unfortunately, often gets kind of pushed to the side, in the bigger story of missions.
Yeah, and we're not going to let that happen.
No, absolutely not.
So for all you listeners out there, buckle up.
Yeah, get ready for a journey.
We're going to, unpack this whole thing together.
Absolutely.
Our mission, and I'm using that word intentionally.
I see what you did there.
Is to give you a really clear and, engaging understanding of this really crucial part of mission history.
That's right.
And we're not going to bog you down with a ton of dates and names.
Yeah, we're going for the big picture.
We want to make this story come alive.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's just jump right in.
All right, let's do it.
One of the things that really struck me when I was reading through this survey was just how early, way back in the 1700s and 1800s, that African Americans had this burning desire to share their faith with the world.
Yeah, that really stood out to me as well.
It's incredible. We're talking about a time when slavery was still a reality in America.
Right.
And in the midst of that, horrific situation, you have these men and women who are just, filled with this passion to spread the gospel.
Yeah, it's so powerful.
It is. And what's also amazing is that their vision wasn't limited to just, one place.
That's right.
They were looking at both Africa, their ancestral homeland, and the Caribbean.
Yeah, they had this really broad vision.
It's incredible.
It is, and I think it speaks to the depth of their faith and their commitment to sharing it.
Absolutely. And, one of the first people that really caught my eye in the survey was Reverend George Leal.
He's a fascinating figure.
He is.
He was a freed slave, and he went on to found the First Baptist Church in Kingston, Jamaica in 1784.
Wow, 1784, that's super early.
It is, and what's even more interesting, the survey points out that one of the reasons he left the United States was actually because he was afraid of being re-enslaved.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you can see how, the desire for personal freedom and the desire to spread the gospel were very much intertwined for him.
That makes his story even more powerful, right?
Definitely.
He's escaping oppression.
Yeah.
And at the same time, he's carrying this message of hope and freedom to a new land.
Absolutely. And, another figure who really stands out from that early period is Reverend Prince Williams.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about him.
Well, he was also a freed slave, and he organized a Baptist church in Florida around 1790.
Wow, Florida. So he was active in the South.
That's right.
That's incredible.
And what's even more remarkable is that in 1801, he managed to secure land for the community there.
That's huge, to establish a church and then actually secure land.
It is, and it just shows you the kind of determination and resilience that these early pioneers had.
Totally. They were building something lasting.
They were.
And it wasn't easy.
Not at all.
So we have Lyle in Jamaica, Williams in Florida.
Yeah.
And then the survey also mentions these other guys, David George, Hector Peters, and Samson Calvert.
Right. They were all active on the west coast of Africa in the 1790s.
So they were already taking the gospel directly to Africa at that time.
They were. And, they were real trailblazers in that sense.
They were laying the groundwork.
Exactly.
So then we come to 1820 and Reverend Daniel Coker.
Yeah. Now he's a significant figure because he was the first African-American Methodist missionary to serve in Africa.
Wow. The first Methodist.
That's right.
And he went to Sierra Leone.
Exactly. And, his story is interesting because it kind of intersects with the American Colonization Society.
Right. The ACS, which was, well, let's just say they had their own reasons for wanting to send freed slaves back to Africa.
Yeah, and the survey kind of delves into that a little bit, and it's a complicated history for sure.
It is, and it's important to acknowledge that, the ACS had some pretty problematic motivations, let's just say.
Yeah, their views on race and colonization were not exactly enlightened, to put it mildly.
Right, but I think it's also important to remember that for guys like Coker,
Yeah.
their primary focus was really on spreading the gospel.
Absolutely. They were using the means available to them at the time.
Right, even if those means were kind of, well, morally ambiguous.
Yeah, and Coker's story is just one example of how African American missionaries often had to navigate these really complex and challenging situations.
Yeah, they were dealing with a lot more than just the typical missionary hardships.
Right.
They were up against, like, systemic racism and prejudice on top of everything else.
Exactly. So you have to admire their perseverance and their unwavering commitment to their mission.
Totally. And speaking of perseverance, we've got to talk about Reverend Locke Carey.
Oh, absolutely. He's a true inspiration.
He is. Born in 1780, worked in a tobacco warehouse in Richmond, Virginia, and then, like, unbelievably managed to buy his and his family's freedom.
I know. That's just incredible.
And then he goes on to learn to read and write and dedicate himself to ministry.
It's an amazing story of transformation.
It really is. And then in 1815, he gets together with some other folks, and they form the African Baptist Foreign Missionary Society.
And that's a significant moment because it was the very first foreign mission organization founded by African Americans in the United States.
Wow, that's a big deal.
It is, and it shows that they were really serious about taking ownership of their missionary efforts.
Totally. They weren't waiting for permission from anyone.
No, they were forging their own path.
So with support from some white allies and the Triennial Convention.
Right, which was the first National Baptist Convention in the U.S., for those who might not know.
Exactly. Carey and another guy named Colin Teague, they set sail for Liberia with their families in 1821.
And they weren't just going there to, like, explore or anything.
Right.
They were going with the express purpose of establishing a missionary presence.
And they did, right?
They founded the Providence Baptist Church in Monrovia.
Which is, like, still there today.
Amazingly, yes.
So their legacy lives on.
It does. And, Carey himself became a really prominent figure in the Liberian colony.
He was a leader in so many ways.
It was. In politics, religion, even in the military and medicine.
Wow. A true Renaissance man.
He was. And he died in 1828. But his impact was huge.
He really set a high bar for those who came after him.
Absolutely.
So we've seen these incredible individuals, these pioneers.
Yeah.
And then we start to see the rise of these formal missionary efforts within different denominations.
That's right. So as we move into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you have the African-American denominations starting to really organize their missionary outreach.
So we're talking about groups like the AME and the AMEZ.
Exactly. The African Methodist Episcopal and African Methodist Episcopal Zion churches.
And they were both sending missionaries to Africa during this time.
That's right. Mainly to West and South Africa.
So they were kind of picking up where those early pioneers had left off.
In a way, yes.
And then, of course, you have the Baptists.
Yeah, and the Baptists, they had a really long and extensive history in missions, as we've already seen.
Right, going all the way back to Lele and Carey and those guys.
Exactly. So it's not surprising that they continued to play a major role in international missions.
And the survey highlights that their efforts were actually more extensive than the Methodists during this period.
That's right. The Baptists had a much larger footprint, so to speak.
And then we have the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, or the CME.
Yeah, they got started a little later. They began their formal missionary work in Africa in 1911.
And where did they focus their efforts?
Well, their first mission was in the Congo, and they partnered with the Methodist Episcopal Church South for that.
Interesting. So a collaboration between different Methodist branches.
Exactly. And later on, they expanded their work to other parts of Africa and the Caribbean.
So we're seeing a real diversification of efforts here.
Definitely. And then you have the Pentecostal movement.
Right, which is a whole other story.
It is. And, the Church of God in Christ, or COGIC, which is the largest African-American Pentecostal denomination, they really started emphasizing international missions after the Civil Rights period.
Oh, so a bit later than the other groups we've talked about.
That's right. And, there are probably a few reasons for that.
Like what?
Well, I think part of it is just that the Pentecostal movement was still relatively young at that point.
Right, they were focused on growing their own movement.
Exactly. And I think they were also very much engaged in the struggle for civil rights here in the U.S.
So their priorities were kind of focused domestically at that time.
Yeah. But once they had a stronger foundation, they really started to expand their missionary efforts internationally.
And that brings us to another really important aspect of this whole story.
What's that?
The challenges that African-American missionaries faced.
Yeah, there were a lot of obstacles in their path.
And it wasn't just the typical stuff that all missionaries deal with.
Right, like language barriers and cultural differences.
Yeah, they had to deal with all that, but they also had to contend with racism and discrimination, both here in the U.S. and abroad.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that really comes through in the survey is this desire for self-determination.
Right. They wanted to be in control of their own missionary work.
Yeah, exactly. They didn't want to be beholden to white missionary organizations or denominations.
And they were concerned about, like, whose priorities were driving the mission.
Exactly. They wanted to make sure that their own vision for mission was being carried out.
So they started forming their own independent mission agencies.
That's right. And that was a huge step forward.
It was. And it wasn't just about independence, though. It was also about, like, having a different approach to missions.
How so?
Well, they were often more focused on, like, social justice and empowerment.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
And they also had a different understanding of, like, what it meant to be in relationship with the people they were serving.
Right. They were less about, like, imposing their own culture and more about building genuine partnerships.
Exactly. And, you know, all of this was happening against the backdrop of, like, this huge national crisis over slavery.
Yeah, that was a really divisive issue, obviously.
It tore the country apart.
And the church was not immune to those divisions.
Yeah. Not at all. In
Yeah.
fact, both the Methodist and Baptist denominations split over the issue of slavery.
Which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. Like, the church, the body of Christ, divided over something so fundamentally opposed to the gospel.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder of how deeply sin can permeate even the most sacred institutions.
It is. And, you know, all of this ultimately led to the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845.
Right, the SBC, which was formed by those who supported slavery.
And, you know, I think a lot of people might assume that the SBC had absolutely nothing to do with African-American missionaries.
Yeah, I can see how people might think that.
But the survey actually points out something really interesting.
What's that?
In the 40 years after the SBC was founded, they actually appointed or supported at least 62 black missionaries.
Wow, that's surprising.
It is. And most of them were sent to Africa.
So even though the SBC was founded on this, like, incredibly problematic principle,
Yeah.
they still had some level of involvement with African-American missionaries.
It's a complex history, that's for sure.
It is. And I think it's a good reminder that, you know, things are rarely black and white, even in history.
So then we come to the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863.
And that was a huge turning point.
It was, and it led to a surge in African Americans forming their own Baptist churches and associations.
Right. They were no longer legally bound to white denominations.
And they were eager to, like, establish their own institutions and pursue their own vision for ministry.
And one of their big priorities was evangelizing Africa.
Absolutely. But the survey points out that it wasn't all smooth sailing.
How so?
Well, there were a lot of regional differences and priorities among these newly formed Black Baptist churches and associations.
So it was hard to get everyone on the same page.
Exactly. There were a lot of different ideas about how to move forward.
And this was all happening at a time when, you know, travel and communication were still pretty difficult.
Right. So it wasn't easy to coordinate efforts across state lines or even across the country.
And that brings us to the story of William W. Cawley.
Ah, yes, a key figure in this whole movement.
He's actually the only African-American Baptist who served as a missionary for both a white-administered agency, the SBC, and a black-administered agency.
He had a really unique perspective.
He did, and his experience with the SBC in West Africa really convinced him that independent black mission initiatives were essential.
Why was that?
Well, he saw firsthand how white control of missions could sometimes lead to, like, cultural insensitivity and a lack of understanding of the needs of the African people.
So he came back to the U.S. determined to create something different.
Exactly. And he became a driving force behind the establishment of the Baptist Foreign Mission Convention, or the BFMC, in 1880.
So the BFMC was born out of this desire for autonomy and a distinct vision for missions in Africa.
That's right. But as the survey points out, their early years were really tough.
In what way?
Well, first of all, the conditions in Africa were incredibly challenging. There were high rates of disease.
Yeah, and back then they didn't have the same medical knowledge or technology that we have today.
Right. So a lot of missionaries, both black and white, died from diseases like malaria and yellow fever.
And there was this myth that African Americans were somehow immune to African diseases.
Which is completely false, of course.
Yeah, it was a dangerous misconception that probably cost a lot of lives.
Absolutely. And on top of the health challenges, the BFMC also faced financial difficulties.
It's always a struggle for mission organizations to raise enough money.
It is, and, the survey suggests that part of the problem for the BFMC was that their support was kind of inconsistent.
How so?
Well, it seems like when a particular state or association had their own missionaries serving in Africa, they were more likely to contribute financially.
So it was like a personal connection thing.
Yeah, but when missionaries had to return home because of illness or other reasons, the interest and the donations kind of dried up.
That makes sense, but it's still a problem.
Oh, absolutely. It made it really difficult for the BFMC to sustain their work.
So by the early 1890s, they were facing some serious challenges.
They were, but they weren't ready to give up.
No, they still believed in their mission.
And they also recognized the need for greater unity and cooperation.
Which led to a pretty significant event in 1895.
That's right. The BFMC merged with other Black Baptist conventions to form the National Baptist Convention USA, Inc.
The NBC USA.
Exactly. And it's interesting to note that one of the main motivations behind this merger was to strengthen their foreign mission work.
So they were putting aside their differences and coming together for the sake of the gospel.
Absolutely. And that's a powerful testament to their commitment.
It is. And, that legacy of international missions continues to this day through organizations like the Foreign Mission Board of the NBC USA and the Lot Carey Baptist Foreign and Home Mission Convention.
Right. They're carrying on the work that those early pioneers started.
So we've seen this incredible journey, this long and winding road that African Americans have traveled in missions.
It's been a journey filled with challenges and triumphs.
But one thing that's clear is that their commitment has never wavered.
Absolutely. And as we move into the 20th and 21st centuries, we see that commitment continuing to evolve and adapt to new realities.
Like what?
Well, after the Civil War, African Americans still face tremendous obstacles here in the U.S.
Jim Crow laws, segregation, all of that.
Exactly. And the Black church had to play a major role in the fight for civil rights.
Which meant that, for a time, international missions might have taken a bit of a backseat.
Yeah, there were just so many pressing issues to deal with at home.
But the survey makes it clear that the desire for world evangelization never really went away.
No, it was always there, simmering beneath the surface.
And in recent decades, we've seen a real resurgence of African American involvement in international missions.
That's right, and it's been really encouraging to see.
It has, and I think part of that is due to the fact that mainline white denominations and missionary sending agencies have started to actively recruit Black missionaries.
Yeah, there's been a growing recognition that diversity is essential for effective missions.
And we're also seeing more and more partnerships between Black congregations here in the U.S. and organizations overseas.
Right, it's becoming more of a collaborative effort.
And the number of African Americans participating in both short-term and long-term missions is steadily increasing.
So the sleeping giant is awakening, as the survey puts it.
I love that image.
It's powerful.
So here we are at the end of our deep dive.
And what a journey it's been.
It has. And if there's one thing I want our listeners to take away from all of this, is that African Americans have a rich and vibrant history in global missions.
Absolutely. It's a story that deserves to be told and celebrated.
And it challenges us to rethink our assumptions about who's involved in missions and what motivates them.
Exactly. And it also raises some really interesting questions about the future of missions.
Like what?
Well, as this sleeping giant fully awakens, what kind of impact will it have on the global church?
That's a great question to ponder.
It is, and I think it's one that we'll be grappling with for years to come.
So for all of you listening, I want to leave you with this thought.
Yeah.
How does understanding this often overlooked history change your perspective on the Christian mission as a whole?
That's a good one.
And how might it inspire you to get involved in missions in a new way?
I think that's a perfect place to end.
It is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep seeking God's heart for the world.
Amen to that.